me wanna holler, go away. I need more peace and hope and love. Where do I find it in this crazy old world? I need strategies, strategies for living radio. Your dose of radio rehab. Strategies for living radio. Every time I listen, Lauren and David share strategies for living, and it makes me aware. I got strategies for living, strategies for living radio. Your dose of radio rehab. Strategies for living radio. Your dose of radio rehab. Strategies for living radio.
Oh, you know we need them. Yeah, we need those strategies, don't we? Those strategies for living. So are you ready? You ready for your daily dose of radio rehab?
Boy, I am ready today.
Yeah, you're anxious for the history lesson today.
Well, the history that's just as important today, just as applicable.
Amen.
Yeah,
Amen. Hey, folks, welcome into another edition of Strategies for Living. I'm Dr. David McMillan. She is psychotherapist, PLPC Lauren Leon McMillan. And, I tell you, you think you know and you think you've read history, and specifically Anne Frank. Well, I mean, there's been so much already written, but our life strategist today is award-winning author Ruth Franklin, and she's got a new book out. It's called The Many Lives of Anne Frank. The Many Lives of Anne Frank. And this thing is a very innovative biography. At first, I thought The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Well, I mean, are we talking reincarnation here? No. What Ruth Franklin is exploring in The Many Lives of Anne Frank, and it's very different for a biography, it's the transformation of Anne Frank from, she was an ordinary teen.
Right.
And
I think
to an icon.
Sure, yeah, because I think sometimes history can become so familiar that we stop seeing the person inside of it. And I think it's important that, across generations, we still ask the same questions that Anne Frank did.
Yeah. And so I'm looking forward to a little bit of history today, a little bit of innovation, and a fresh way to look at the many lives of Anne Frank. Our award-winning author Ruth Franklin is our life strategist today.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, glad you're here too, folks. Thank you for being with us here on Strategies for Living. And we appreciate our sponsors who make it all possible. The Robinson Film Center and Azalea Cleaners and Pintail Roofing and Learning RX. We train your brain. The Balanced Life Wellness Center. Fertitta's Delicatessen, home of The Godfather, Alligator Italian Sausage, pretty good Muffies too, Uprising Addiction Center, and Mira Direct Primary Care. The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Ruth Franklin is our life strategist today here on Strategies for Living. Come back with us.
Tune in daily, find the light. Healthy mind and spirits bright. Strategies for living strong. Feel the vibe, it won't go wrong. Body moves and soul alive. Catch the rhythm, feel the time. Radio rehab every day. Chase those clouds of gray away. Your daily dose of radio rehab. Lift you up when skies seem drab. Mind and body, spirits free. Living life in harmony.
And welcome into Strategies for Living. Lauren Leon McMillan, David McMillan. Let's welcome into the program now Ruth Franklin. She is the author of Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography, and that book was named a New York Times notable book, a Time Magazine top nonfiction book, and the best book of 2016 by the Boston Globe, NPR, and others. Her first book, A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Literature, is a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. It explores the juxtaposition of testimony and imagination in works by writers such as Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi and W.G. Sebald. Her freelance work appears in a lot of publications, and her new book, as we've already talked about, The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Ruth Franklin, welcome. Welcome to Strategies.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Oh, absolutely. So, let's get the basic questions out of the way. What drew you? What drew you personally to Anne Frank, her story, beyond this historical significance that we all know? Everybody knows that, but what drew you to say, I've got to write a book, and specifically a new kind of book about Anne Frank?
Well, like so many girls, and I think, Jewish girls in particular, but like so many girls, I grew up reading the Diary of Anne Frank. It was such a foundational book for so many of us, especially, as teenagers.
Yes.
But, as I grew older, I started noticing that there were occasionally news stories about, for instance, missing pages from Anne's diary being discovered.
Yeah.
And this idea that there were different versions of the diary out there. And I became really, really curious about what that meant, because, of course, that's not the way Anne's diary was presented when we were reading it. And when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, it was supposed to be a war diary.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to get to the bottom of what it meant that, in fact, Anne had revised her own diary, and, what that meant about how we should understand the book. And at the same time, we see Anne becoming more and more of an icon. Her face is on billboards, and there's statues of her all around the world. People can quote her most famous lines. And of course, she's invoked in all kinds of political contexts.
Right.
And so the aim of my book was really to, bring those two elements together, and to, first of all, come back to who was Anne Frank, the real person who wrote this book.
Yeah.
And at the same time, what has made her diary so enduring and so iconic.
So when you kind of immersed like that into Anne's life and the writings, what you knew and then what you discovered, what was the biggest surprise for you, Ruth? What surprised you the most of who Anne Frank actually was?
Well, I think the thing that I really didn't know was that she had gone back to the beginning and rewritten her entire diary with the hope that it would find a readership. And she did this actually after hearing a Dutch minister from the government in exile on the radio call upon citizens to save their documents from the war years for inclusion in a future national archive. And he said on the radio, he said, history cannot be written on the basis of official documents alone. What we really need are the personal records of ordinary people who survived this period of occupation to tell their own stories. And Anne heard this, and she realized that she had just such a document, but also that the way that she had originally written her diary wasn't really suitable for this future national archive because it was so personal, and it didn't have quite enough context about the persecution of the Jews in general.
Right.
And so she went back to the beginning and literally rewrote the whole thing on new pieces of paper. And, it's really fortunate that she did that, because at least one of her original notebooks has been lost. It was lost in the raid, the Gestapo raid on the annex, when Anne and all the other residents were arrested and never found again. So if she hadn't created, this whole new version, this whole new copy, we would not have the diary as we know it now.
Wow. So she really knew what she was doing, what she was.
It's really, really, her presence of mind is really incredible.
Yeah.
And there's one moment in one little change that she made, I think, that really encapsulates the way that she understood her task. And it's in this entry where she writes about hearing this minister speak on the radio. And she's thinking about it afterwards, and she says, "Wouldn't it be funny if 10 years from now, people were to read about how we lived and what we ate here and what we talked about while we were in hiding?"
Yeah.
And when she revisits that entry just a few months later, as she's revising everything, she changes it from, "Wouldn't it be funny if people were to know this?" to, "Wouldn't it be funny if we Jews were to tell how we lived during these days in hiding?" She's already realized that it's so important for the Jews to be able to tell their own story about what happened to them.
Yeah.
Is that, we read what's out there with Anne Frank, and there's a lot, and we think we know her. And yet your book is kind of saying, time out. We don't know. you don't know all that needs to be known about Anne Frank.
It's funny you say that, because even her father said, after he read the diary, of course he didn't read it during her lifetime.
Right.
It was saved by some of the helpers who provided the Franks and the other residents of the annex with food and other things. After their raid, these two women came to see if there was anything that could be salvaged from the annex, and they found Anne's diary on the floor and picked it up and saved it in the hope that she would return. And when it was confirmed that she had died, Pease, who was Otto Frank's secretary and his great friend throughout his life, gave Otto the diary, saying, "This is your daughter Anne's legacy to you." And Otto would later say that he realized after reading it that he had never really known his own daughter. He had no idea the kind of things that she was thinking about. I think so many of us who are parents of teenagers can relate to that.
Oh, yeah.
That's exactly where I was going. I mean, we think we know each other, and yet, do we really? Even as close as parents are to children, even as close as
spouses.
Well, even as close as ourselves.
Yep.
And I wonder if Anne, writing her own diary and then revising it, helped her to know herself better, almost like journaling does for a lot of people. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, Ruth.
Absolutely. And I think, writing a diary can be, it is a process of getting to know oneself. And it's also a process of creating oneself. I think especially for a writer writing a diary, there's an opportunity to try out, different personas, different ways of speaking, of writing, of narrating one's life. So many writers, like we look at the diary of Virginia Woolf, for instance, or Susan Sontag. Writers really create themselves in those pages, and it's really, really exciting. And that's what we see Anne doing over the course of these 2 years that she spent in hiding.
Maybe that's a pitch for more people who need to do journaling. And
sounds like a lesson in, the importance of preserving our own inner life and meeting ourselves.
Not just preserving, but just as Ruth said, creating.
Yes.
I mean, that's, wow. It's almost mind-boggling when you stop and think about it.
I agree with you. I think that's really important. And I would just add that, maybe especially for women writers and, for very young women writers like Anne, it's really, a radical thing to put your words on the page in that way. You're creating space for yourself as a writer.
Yes.
Just the act of writing the journal is saying, my words matter. I am putting them down. I am saving them. This is important. And I think, for a lot of writers, that step can be really transformative.
Yeah.
What kind of feedback have you had since The Many Lives of Anne Frank came out? What are you hearing?
Well, I've been really happy to hear from a lot of people that, my book showed them aspects of Anne that they had never known or never even thought about. It's really surprising to me the amount of people who don't know that Anne rewrote her diary, that it was intended to be a public document. People sometimes, will be critical of Otto Frank for publishing his daughter's diary, maybe against her will. Um, and so, even though it's been, scholarly knowledge, it's been, published for about almost 40 years since it was discovered that there were there was this original version. That has been published in a big scholarly edition where you can compare all the different versions almost 40 years ago. And yet, the myth that Anne's diary somehow, sprang fully formed from her pen
Yeah.
is so enduring.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting to think about why we cling to that idea of that's how a diary should be.
We'll explore, we'll
Yeah.
continue to explore that and much more with Ruth Franklin today. The Many Lives of Anne Frank. That's her new book. You can find it at your favorite bookseller. We're going to take a break. We'll come back. We've got much more today with Ruth Franklin here on Strategies for Living.
Strategies for living radio. Your daily dose of radio rehab. Strategies
And
for
welcome
living
back
radio.
into Strategies for Living Radio. Lauren Leon McMillan, David McMillan with Ruth Franklin today. Her new book, it's a good one. It's The Many Lives of Anne Frank. We think we know, and yet, that's one of the lessons of history. You know what, Lauren, I couldn't help, and Ruth, I couldn't help thinking during our last segment. Lauren, you and I talk a lot on the program about different theories from time to time
Yes.
in psychology and counseling and that type of thing.
Sure.
And in the last decade and a half, 2 decades, there's been one called internal family systems, also
yes.
referred to as parts theory.
Right.
The idea is that we all are complex. So we're not that we're multiple personalities or
Right.
anything like that, but there are many parts
Many facets of
many
who we are.
facets to who we are.
Right.
And they're internal to us. And some of them are kind of exiled
Right.
parts.
And part of the journey of a life is to be able to hopefully meet and integrate all of those parts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Ruth, I know, this is not your area, but I was fascinated listening to you during the first segment, and I thought, wow, you've written a book about parts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I think often, in the process of keeping a diary, gives us an opportunity to sort of surface different, maybe what would you call it, members of those parts, different aspects of
Yeah.
ourselves or our characters that might appear on the page
Mhm.
at different times. And I think one constant theme in Anne's diary is her tension with her mother, right? Like so many teenage girls, she's constantly fighting with her mother. It's of course exacerbated by their close quarters, the conditions of them being in hiding, not being able to leave the annex, or sometimes not even move around. It would test any relationship really,
Sure.
but especially the teenage daughter and the mother. And that was something that whereas on the other hand she really seems to have idolized her father, and often, almost always writes about him in a very, very positive way in the diary, whereas her mother comes in for more criticism. But there's evidence that she was even starting to work through that during the period she was keeping the diary. She would sometimes go back and reread her old entries and make notes in the margin with the date, the date of when she was going back to them, so we
Oh,
can
wow.
see the progression of time.
Yeah.
And she'd make notes in the margin saying things like, I can't believe I ever thought this.
Mm.
I can't believe I was so naive as to write these things.
Yeah.
And, I think psychologically, it's a fascinating study because, those years from 13 to 15, which is the period that she was in hiding, those years are so developmentally important
Yes.
for any teenager.
Yes.
But I think, especially for Anne, going through what she experienced during those years, the annex was just like a crucible
Yeah.
from which she emerged, where she experienced this really accelerated developmental process.
Yeah.
What do you, speaking of that idea of where she was, not only in her development as a human, but also, of course, in history, what do you think Anne Frank specifically can teach us about maintaining identity and inner life during periods of fear, uncertainty, and confinement like she was?
I love the way you put that, maintaining identity and inner life during this period of great stress.
Yeah.
And, I don't think she did it intentionally, but keeping her diary
Right.
was a way of maintaining that identity, of telling her own story.
Mm.
So many things happened to her that she had no control over, right? She had no control over going into hiding.
Right.
That decision was made for her by her parents, but also by the Nazis. The reason the Franks went into hiding at the moment that they did was because Anne's sister received what was called a call-up notice, telling her to report for so-called a work detail in Germany. Of course, and we now know that was deportation to a concentration camp. And the Franks went into hiding the very next day because they had been preparing this space that they could use in case of emergency. She had no control over that. She had no control over the food that she ate. She grew and she didn't have enough clothing, clothes that fit her. She had control over basically no element of her life. But what she could control was her own narrative, the way she framed it, the way she thought about it. And she does try on these different personas, these different voices in the diary. One element that caused her particular pain and stress was that she had to share her room with this dentist, Fritz Pfeffer, who became the 8th resident of the annex a few months into their period in hiding. And he was this middle-aged guy. I think he was in his late 40s, I think, and he had to share Anne's bedroom with her. It was the only available space for him to sleep because the quarters were so small. And it's clear that she hated having to share her room with this gross middle-aged guy who snored, and and that he didn't like it any more than she did.
Right.
He was really intolerant of her and of her needs as a teenager, and they fought a lot over access to the little table in their room, which of course she wanted to use to do her schoolwork, as well as to write her diary. And she often writes about her anger, her real rage at this guy who's so disrespectful of her. But she also often frames it in a really funny way. And she makes fun of him. She makes fun of the things that he says. She makes fun of the way he looks, and not in the kindest way. But clearly it's a very useful coping mechanism to bring that element of humor into her narrative framing of her circumstances.
Yeah, I'm going to raise my hand to this because just listening to you, reading the book, listening to you today makes me understand that we've oversimplified who Anne Frank is. I mean, I put my hand up because we've made her into this symbol of in ways that really overshadow her own humanity, haven't we?
I think that's right. And we can take some solace from the fact that we're not the first. One line that always stuck in my mind was her history teacher from the high school that she very briefly attended before having to go into hiding. Her history teacher later wrote a poem about Anne Frank that includes the lines, "Nobody saw anything special in her."
Mm.
Hmm.
Can you believe it? And so, but I think, on the one hand, that tells us she really seemed like a typical teenager.
Yeah.
And, indeed, in the early pages of her diary, especially in the original version, she, she's just like any other girl. She's writing about, gossip and her boyfriends, and she goes out for ice cream, all the really normal stuff.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating to think about all the people around us, right? Who we might think, oh, I don't see anything special in this person, but in reality, what do we ever know of someone else's inner life,
Yeah.
as you
Yeah.
said earlier?
Yeah. So when as you dove in, as you wrote this, what would you hope we today, our modern folk, right?
What do we need to know?
What do we need to understand from Anne's life, her personality, what we've already known and what you're making known to us? What should we be understanding better, Ruth?
Well, I think one really important element of Anne's story is that there has always been, since the diary was first published, there has been this tension between understanding her as a universal figure, who we can all relate to. She's just like anybody else. And at the same time, understanding what happened to her as a specifically Jewish tragedy, persecution, simply because she was a Jew.
Right.
And that tension has, we can feel it in basically everything that's happened to the diary since it was published, the way that it was published, and her father and her American publisher, especially, really trying to market and frame the diary as a universal book. And of course, in the way it has become a universal touchstone for people around the world. People in the diary has been translated into, I think, more than 70 languages. And it's astonishing the way it is able to touch a chord with so many people. And yet, I think we run the risk when we do see Anne as a universal figure, as a kind of, symbol for a symbol for tolerance, a symbol against prejudice of any kind, we run the risk of erasing her Jewish identity. And so I think it's really important to keep both of those ideas in our heads at once. That she can at once be somebody who is relatable to by so many people, and at the same time a representative of the Holocaust, of the dangers of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all here. I mean, Anne was navigating through identity and fear and family tension and hope and adolescence all at the same time. Yeah. Anne Frank was incredible, wasn't she? Yeah. But
it's a lot for anyone to handle.
it really is. I'm wondering, we got about a minute here before I have to go to break. In writing this book, did you look back at your own teenage emotional life and discover something, Ruth?
Well, wow, what a great question. I mean, my own teenage emotional life, I will admit, was not without a certain amount of tension with my mother.
Yeah.
But as a larger thing, one of my children actually was 13 when I started working on this book, the same age that Anne was starting when she started her diary. And I have to say that, reading Anne's diary as a teenager is one thing, but reading it as a parent is really a whole different perspective.
Yeah.
And I found myself sympathizing so deeply with Otto Frank and what he experienced.
So another reason that you need to go get a copy of this new book that Ruth Franklin has written. It's called The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Very provocative title, but very appropriate title. The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Ruth Franklin with us today as our life strategist here on Strategies for Living. We've got more to come. Stay here.
We all have problems every day. We all need help along the way. We need strategies, strategies, strategies for living radio.
And welcome back into Strategies for Living Radio. Ruth Franklin, our life strategist today, the author of The Many Lives of Anne Frank, Lauren Leon McMillan, David McMillan. Lauren, you know what strikes me with what we're talking about so far, and that is that people, you know how everybody listens to radio. They tune in, they tune out, and some people have gotten bits and pieces of our interview today with Ruth Franklin and might be saying, gee, I wish I could hear the whole thing.
Well, you can.
Yeah.
We're on podcast.
There you
wherever
go.
You listen to podcasts.
So, folks, all you got to do is wherever you get your podcast, whether that's Stratify or Apple or iHeart, wherever you get your podcast, go and search for Strategies for Living. And we'll come up and you can subscribe to us. And this program and a whole lot more will be available to you. All freebie, right?
That's it.
And so enjoy. You can pass on anything you'd like here on Strategies for Living. So, you know, there's so many. One of the hard things in interviewing somebody like you, Ruth, is there's so many different ways that I could go. You know, there's so many different aspects of your work.
I do have a question, actually.
Okay.
And this is kind of predictive. If Anne Frank had survived the war, what do you think? What do you think she would have produced in the world, or would she have continued writing? What do you see as how would her image have been different? Perhaps, Ruth?
That's such an interesting question. You know, so in the book, as a biographer, I feel really uncomfortable with any kind of speculation about, you know, anything we don't know about Anne Frank.
Right.
I'm reluctant to say, but, you know, since we're not in the book, we're just having a conversation. I find it hard to imagine that she wouldn't have become a writer, right?
Yeah.
Because that was what she really wanted. She wanted to write fiction. She imagined writing the story of what happened in the annex as a work of fiction. She imagined it as a novel. So I think, you know, it's likely that she would have used the raw material of her diary to produce, you know, potentially a great novel about the war. You know, the other thing I think she might have done is, you know, we know about the Holocaust in general. The stories we know about it tend to be told by men, right? We know Night by Elie Wiesel, of course, is one of the best known works, or Primo Levi's Survival at Auschwitz. And so we have, you know, I wouldn't say a distorted vision of what happened, but we have less about the story of what happened to women in the concentration camps. And that's something that I go into quite a bit in the book, because it's something that, frankly, I knew much less about before I did the research that I did to try to reconstruct what happened to Anne in Auschwitz and in Bergen-Belsen, which, of course, is a time of her life when we don't have her own words. We don't know if she managed to keep a diary while she was in the camps, but if she did, it hasn't survived.
Yeah.
And, you know, some of the, especially, you know, the social relationships among women in those camps, the way women stuck so close together as family groups or as groups of friends, they really looked out for each other in a way that we don't see in the same way in memoirs of the Holocaust written by men. I found it so moving, and important. And I felt the absence of the book that Anne might have written had she survived. She might have written a Holocaust testimony that we would be reading now alongside, you know, those other canonical works like Night and Survival at Auschwitz. And if that had happened, our view of the Holocaust, you know, might be different in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Did obviously you did lots and lots and lots of research to write the book. Did doing all of that leave you more hopeful, feeling hopeful about humanity, or more worried about us?
That's a great question. And I would say it did leave me more hopeful. And this is why, if my husband's hearing this, he would be astonished that I said that because, we had this period when I was doing a lot of research, particularly about the situation in the concentration camps when, I would come down every day and say, "Oh my God, I just found out this horrible, gruesome detail, about what happened in such and such a camp." And he would say, "I don't understand how you can keep reading this dark, dark history." But something else I did while working on this book, I was started collecting stories of people whose lives were changed by their encounter with Anne Frank's diary. And they ranged from a lot of them were the stories of artists. Like in the book, I tell the story of the lead singer of the band Neutral Milk Hotel, a very well-known indie rock band from the early 2000s. He read the diary and he used it to inspire a whole album that's now regarded as one of the best albums of the last 25 years. About that is in some ways it's a song cycle around inspired by the diary of Anne Frank. You can hear little bits and pieces of her life, of her words, her image there. Um, there's this another of my favorites is the story of this man, an Eritrean refugee from the civil war in his country, who discovered the diary in a refugee camp in Ethiopia and found it so meaningful that he started translating it into his own native language so that his people could read it. And he kept this translation, this handwritten translation of the diary with him through his long refugee trek through Sudan and Egypt. And eventually he even wound up in Israel and finally came to the United States. Kept at one point he lost the manuscript and had to start translating it all over again. And so, I think it does fill me with hope that her diary became what it became. This document that really had the power to change the lives of people who came in contact with it.
Yeah. And, we only have about a minute left before we have to go to break, but Anne's diary's often been described as almost a spiritual text of hope. Is that accurate, do you think?
Absolutely. And it's something that many people don't realize is that Anne really was sustained in large part in the annex by her faith in God. And it's something she talks about the wanting to being able to, she longs to go out in nature and experience God that way. And she can't, of course. She's confined to the annex. All she can do is open the windows late at night when nobody's watching. And dare to put her head out. And even in that, she finds a kind of spiritual sustenance.
The Many Lives of Anne Frank. That's the book. Ruth Franklin is the author. It's a New Yorker best book of the year. Get it at your favorite bookseller. And we'll be back to wrap up our conversation today with Ruth Franklin here on Strategies for Living. And welcome back in. Welcome back into Strategies for Living. Lauren Leon McMillan, David McMillan. We have not had many guests as just profound and good as Ruth Franklin.
Amen.
This is good stuff. Many Lives of Anne Frank, Ruth Franklin. Ruth, what do you want people to most take away from our conversation today, from your book and our conversation today? What do you really want people to take away?
I think I would love for people, even if they think they know the story of Anne Frank, because of course we all are familiar with the outline of her life and what happened to her. She tells that story so well in her diary. Even so, I would love for them to just to be a little curious and open to the idea that there might be elements of that familiar story that we don't know quite as well, right? Anne's own intentions in writing and revising her diary, all of that, all of what was going on in the world around her while she was in hiding, and then of course the way the diary goes out into the world and becomes the iconic text it is today. I think there are a lot of surprises in the way that story unfolds.
Yeah, I love your answer. I don't know how many times we say on this program, if I live to 150, and I keep, extending that, I want to be a curious student right up to the end. Ruth, thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this book. Thank you for being a great life strategist. Lauren, thank you. And folks, thank you. We appreciate you joining us here for Strategies for Living. But we really appreciate our sponsors who make it all possible. The Robinson Film Center, Azalea Cleaners, Pintail Roofing, Learning RX, We Train Your Brain, the Balanced Life Wellness Center, Fertitas Delicatessen, home of The Godfather, Alligator Italian Sausage, and Pretty Good Muffies too, SRT Sales Training, Uprising Addiction Center, and Mira Direct Primary Care. If today were the last day of your life, you only had one more phone call that you could make, who is it that you'd call? What is it that you'd say? And why are you waiting? Make the call. For Ruth Franklin and for Lauren Leon McMillan, I'm David McMillan. See you next time right here on Strategies for Living.